there are some pretty highly aggressive people in Washington, D.C. who are trying to turn the MAGA movement into the opposite of what it was created to be, the opposite of what voters hoped it would be when they voted for it, what tens of millions of Americans believed it was. And so before that happens completely, and before we forget what MAGA once was, it's probably worth stating in very clear terms what it is. What is MAGA? Well, MAGA, of course, means Make America Great Again. It's an acronym, but what does that mean exactly? We don't have to guess because Donald Trump, for 10 years, 10 full years, 2015 to 2025, has been articulating again and again and again, a remarkable level of repetition, actually, 5 consistent themes about what this is. What is MAGA? So let's go through and name and explain the 5 pillars of MAGA. It's not exactly the Bill of Rights, but in political terms, it's meaningful. These are the founding principles of the governing political coalition that runs the United States right now. And they are too rarely articulated. So let's do that. Let's start with number 1. What is the first pillar of MAGA? Well, of course, it's America First. Here's Donald Trump, before he got the nomination for president, and I think in the spring of 2016, explaining what America First means. Here he is.
My foreign policy will always put the interests of the American people and American security above all else. Has to be first. Has to be. That will be the foundation of every single decision that I will make. America First will be the major and overriding theme of my administration.
April 27th, 2016. At the time, Donald Trump had been elected to nothing. He'd not even officially secured the nomination. Ted Cruz was still running against him until the Indiana primary the next month. He was still just a candidate, totally unproven. But the central theme of the next 10 years of his political life and of the country's political life is right there in that clip, America First. The purpose and duty of the American government is to represent the United States of America. Another way to put it would be the duty of the U.S. government is to make good on the core promise of democracy, which is that the country operates on behalf of its owners, the citizens of that country. It would seem very obvious. Of course, Trump was attacked for it immediately. He was called an anti-Semite. You may not remember this, but he was, because he used a phrase that Charles Lindbergh, who was, by the way, not an anti-Semite, but who did oppose American entry into World War II, along with tens of millions of other Americans, used very often. The America First movement was the American movement of the late 1930s, early 1940s, pushing the Roosevelt administration away from joining a war in Europe. Doesn't mean they were pro-Nazi. Many of them were very anti-Nazi, but they didn't think the United States had a role in that war, and they said it. And probably the most famous living American at the time, Charles Lindbergh, who in 1927 flew across the Atlantic Ocean solo, truly a hero, was the leader of this movement. And of course, history being what it is, rewritten by the victors, he has been slandered ever since as some sort of hater or pro-Hitler, anti-Semite or something. He was none of the above. But the point is, when Trump used the phrase America First, he was attacked as some sort of deviant, moral deviant. But the idea itself was so self-evidently true, like obvious, that for a lot of people, even non-Republicans, a light bulb went off. Wait a second. You mean the government doesn't operate on that principle? We always assume that our government, which we pay for, which does everything it does in our name, the country that we were born in, that our ancestors built, we assumed they were always acting on our behalf, that every decision was made through the lens, is this good for the United States or not? And it took Donald Trump's entry from real estate into politics in 2015 to awaken the rest of the country that actually no. Many decisions, some of the biggest decisions the U.S. government makes, have no reference point at all in American interest. They just don't care whether it's good for the United States. Well, that's not only inherently anti-democratic, it's illegitimate. That's not a legitimate government. If you have a democratic republic whose government is not acting on behalf of the citizens, you don't have a legitimate government. That's grounds for overthrowing the government, actually. So people were shocked by this, and Trump was attacked. But of course, you know the rest. He went on to win the nomination and the presidency that year, really on the basis of that idea. America First. You can have only one true allegiance, and it needs to be to the United States. You can't have dual citizenship because you can't have dual loyalty. In the same way that polygamy, for whatever its benefits, doesn't work very well in the long run because you can't be truly loyal to 2 wives. Sorry. And you can't be truly loyal to 2 countries because sometimes their interests intersect, but very often they diverge, and you have to pick one because there's a fork in the road and you can only take one path. And it has to be the path that serves the country that you live in, and that's the United States of America, America First. So that's the first principle of MAGA, and every decision that this ruling coalition makes has to be made through the lens of America First, period. But there are 4 remaining pillars that derive from the first. So is America First. The second point that Trump made again and again and again and rode to the presidency that year, and once again in 2024, is that the country has to control its borders. If you do not control your borders, you are not a country, because a nation state is a physical place identifiable on a map. It has borders. There's a difference between 10 feet on this side and 10 feet on the other side, a totally different set of laws, often customs, language. One's this country, the other's that country. You can have a global country. It doesn't work, and it's inherently tyrannical. And Trump made that point again and again by saying, famously, build that wall. Here he is.
We're going to have strong, incredible borders, and people are going to come into our country, but they're going to come into our country legally. They're going to come in legally. We're going to build a wall. It's going to be built.
We're going to build a wall. That was almost 10 years ago. The wall has not been built, despite what you may hear. There is not a wall spanning the U.S.-Mexico border. There are portions of wall, but for a bunch of different reasons, it has not been built. And that is a measure of several things, but one of them is the resistance to that idea in Washington. It turns out, and we learned this during that campaign, the Republican Party didn't want to build a wall, actually. That's why they'd never tried. And they didn't want to build a wall because they didn't want distinct borders, and they didn't want distinct borders because they weren't nationalists, they were globalists. So by saying that, Trump didn't actually end up building the wall, but he did end up revealing the nature of the people running the country, which is completely deceptive and rotten. They were deceptive and rotten, and they were busted being that way. And to this day, they've resisted actual border control. And to this day, they're digging in their heels on deportation. And to this day, they're denying that the native population, the American-born population, is being replaced, but it is. And that's not a conspiracy theory. It's hardly hate to note what the numbers are, but the numbers show very clearly that people who were born in this country and whose parents and grandparents were born in this country are soon going to be a minority. They are being replaced by people from other countries. It's just a fact. It's not a great replacement theory. It's a great replacement reality measurable through census numbers. And the resistance of both parties to acknowledging that simple mathematical fact tells you everything about their intent, which is highly sinister. They want it. And a lot of those people are Republicans. They've disliked Trump from day one for pushing for this. They dislike him now. But we know that because he said it. He articulated the truth out loud, and that illuminated the positions of everyone else in the room. And for that, the rest of us should be forever grateful. But that's pillar two. You have to have real borders. And the people who live in the country have a moral and legal right to choose who else joins them in the same way that a homeowner has a right to decide who sleeps in his house because it's his house. This is a foundational right. If it's our country, we determine who lives next door to us. And if it's not, we don't. It's literally that simple. So America first, the country must have secure borders. Those are the first two. The third pillar of MAGA, and this is something that President Trump, now President Trump, then candidate Trump, articulated from the very first days of his campaign, is that the war on terror and all pointless wars, wars that do not serve America's direct national interest, in other words, wars that are not wars of self-defense, wars that are not repelling an invasion, are pointless, and worse than pointless, they are bad for the United States. They are corrosive of our social order. They completely overturn our society on some hard to measure but yet obvious over time level. They're incredibly expensive. And by the way, they kill Americans and a lot of other people. They're bad. And they're almost never waged in an effort to serve our interests, but instead to serve the interests of other countries. He said that for the very first time in the February, I think, of 2016 GOP primary debate in Greenville, South Carolina, when he said right to the face of former President Bush's brother, Jeb, the Iraq war was a disaster. And at the time, that was considered so shocking that people couldn't even believe he said it. In fact, at Fox, where I then work, one of our most brilliant analysts said, he made a huge mistake because South Carolina, checking the briefing book, South Carolina is the highest proportion of military veterans of any of the states. And of course, naturally, they love the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. People still talk like this in 2016. Thanks to Trump, they no longer do. They've been exposed as dummies and liars. No matter what the briefing book says, the opposite turned out to be true, which is that people who had wasted years of their lives and lost friends and developed all kinds of psychological and physical damage from these wars and were at the very least apart from their families for years at a time, these were the people most likely to be opposed to more pointless wars. But Trump kept up this theme, and in some ways it was the most controversial thing he ever said, then or now. No more wars. Here's Donald Trump making the exact same point much more recently.
We are never going back to a party that wants to give unlimited money to fight foreign wars, that are endless wars, that are stupid wars. I was the only president in modern history who did not have any new wars, no new wars. I finished some old ones. We'll be stopping the slide into costly and never-ending wars. We've got to stop it. Can't keep spending hundreds of billions of dollars protecting people that don't even like us.
We can't keep spending tens of billions of dollars to protect people who don't even like us. I will stop this. That was one of the most popular things Trump said in 2016, up until that was March of 2023 at CPAC, up until recently. Every time Trump says that, including in the UN speech not that long ago, he gets wild applause from his own voters. If there is one theme, if you were to survey 100 people who voted for Donald Trump in 2016, 2020, and 2024, why did you vote for him? You would find an overwhelming majority voted for him in part because they don't want more pointless wars, because since 2001, we've had an endless succession of them, and we haven't won a single one. Not a single one. And every single one of them has weakened the United States in measurable ways and hurt Americans deeply in measurable ways. One of the reasons we have an opioid crisis is because of those wars. And not a single one of those wars was waged on behalf of the United States or its interests. Every single one of them was waged on behalf of our so-called allies or some stupid idea about turning the Middle East into Western Europe or something, even as Western Europe itself descended to a level that's below the Middle East, which it is right now. People feel deep and justified resentment about that. Donald Trump harnessed that and articulated it, and he was the only one to do it. That clip you just saw from CPAC in 2023, when he said that, the most popular Republican candidate at the Wall Street Journal, the New York Post, and Fox News, and among all the donors in the Republican Party was not Donald Trump at all. In fact, he was fighting to stay out of jail when he said that. He was considered a has-been. It was going to be Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, who was a pretty effective governor of Florida and a much admired governor of Florida. But during the campaign, we also found out that he was just a tool of his donors and a screaming low-IQ neocon. It was Ron DeSantis, or it was Nikki Haley, who was busy telling us that we need Israel more than Israel needs us, and other things that were so nonsensical and insane that no one dared ask her to explain them. Those were the favorites, the anti-Trumps. The candidates who are going to undo the damage that Trump had done to our sacred alliances with NATO and other countries we have literally nothing to do with and almost no common interest with, but to whom we send billions and billions and billions, tens, hundreds over the years of billions of dollars to do what? To bring gay rights to Lithuania or something? It's not even clear. But a lot of people in Washington are getting rich from these multinational organizations, these peacekeeping organizations, and a lot of highly ideological foreign policy establishment figures who do not have America's interests first in mind and never have, use those wars for their own ends, which again are not related to America's interests on any level. In fact, run directly contrary to America's interests, hurt America. And so at the moment when Trump was about to go to jail, it looked like, and fighting against what seemed like a wave of donor investment in Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis, he comes out and says, no, I'm the opposite. No more wars. And guess what happened? He won the nomination and he won the presidency again. So anyone who would say, well, that wasn't an important part of his platform, that's not actually a pillar, right? This just happened. We remember it and it's on tape. No more wars, pillar 3. Pillar 4, how about some real jobs? Donald Trump, from day one, 2015, the famous escalator ride, in fact, going back 40 years in his CNN appearances, for example, with Larry King, or his work on ABC, would almost always make the same point in various ways, but it was the same point, which was globalization shortchanges America. It helps bankers, it helps the finance class quite a bit. Once you financialize things in a globalized economy, money moves much more easily, there's much less friction, and a small number of people get very, very rich, but the country itself becomes a husk. It becomes hollowed out. There's nothing for people to do, and a country that doesn't make anything is not a real country. Everyone sort of knows this intuitively, but libertarian economists, basically doing the bidding of the finance class, have for the past 40 years told us, no, it's totally fine, because it hikes GDP. Oh, GDP. As if GDP is the only or even the best measure of the health of an economy or the health of a nation or the health of its people. And of course, that's ridiculous. GDP is the measure of all economic activity. What does that mean? What does that mean? Well, not much, actually. A country that doesn't make anything, a country that has, say, 6 thriving cities and the rest of the continent falling into poverty is not a thriving country. It's a dying country. And Donald Trump has made that point consistently for 40 years. Bring back real jobs. Finance is not enough. Here's one among 1,000 examples of him saying that.
Our politicians have aggressively pursued a policy of globalization, moving our jobs, our wealth, and our factories to Mexico and overseas. Globalization has made the financial elite who donate to politicians very, very wealthy. But it's left millions of our workers with nothing but poverty and heartache.
Every word of that is true. And if you don't believe it, drive from Los Angeles to New York City if you dare. Stop along the way, stay in local hotels, motels, and ask yourself, what is this? Is this the country I remember? No. This is a poor country in many places, especially outside the cities. And some of our cities are becoming really poor, including Los Angeles, our second biggest city. So it's a crisis, and it is primarily an economic crisis, and its downstream effects are countless, and they include all kinds of social crises. But at the heart of this is an economy that has been completely hollowed out by finance. And it's not actually the Chinese who did this. It's Americans who did this, actually. The Chinese never invaded this country and stole our manufacturing jobs. They didn't occupy our factories. They didn't force, Kenmore to make its washing machines in Wuhan. No. American companies were sold piecemeal to the Chinese for the profit of the people who owned those companies or who were financing, who owned the debt on those companies, et cetera, et cetera. That's just true. And Trump has said that again and again and again, and he got elected president on it. So that is the 4th pillar of MAGA. Bring back a real economy. Globalization is not working for the United States at all. Most Americans agree with that. That's why Trump got the majority of the popular vote. And the 5th pillar of MAGA is very simple. Free speech. It's our birthright. It's the first right enumerated in the Bill of Rights. It was given to us by God. The purpose of having the U.S. government is to protect that right, among several others. But that is the most basic human right. That is the difference between slavery and freedom. Can you say what you actually think? Now, censorship is an ongoing threat in every society at every time in history. The powerful do not want the people over whom they rule to complain about the way they're ruling, or complain about their behavior, or in our case, complain about their looting. And so they devise all kinds of schemes, sometimes dressed up as religious precepts. That's a blasphemy. You can't say that. In our secular age, those same attempts have been dressed up as sensitivity. Oh, you're being mean to black people. You can't say that about the LGBT community. Oh, that's anti-Semitic. Whatever it is. Those demands for censorship have been couched as a way to protect marginalized groups. But they remain what they've always been. An attempt to keep less powerful people from criticizing the most powerful people. That's exactly what they are. They're attempts at censorship. Always. And Donald Trump, in his relentless attacks on, quote, woke culture, has been the most effective articulator of this in American politics in a generation, a century, maybe ever. Donald Trump has stood up against censorship, whether he knew he was doing it or not, from the very first day by saying things you weren't allowed to say and then not apologizing for them, broadening the boundaries of acceptable discourse in public, taking the flack for, broadening the famous Overton window again and again and again. Here's just one example from the last campaign of Trump explaining why wokeness is really just an attempt to make you shut up.
Americans are exhausted trying to keep up with the latest lists of approved words and phrases and the ever more restrictive political decrees. Many things have a different name now, and the rules are constantly changing. The goal of cancel culture is to make decent Americans live in fear of being fired, expelled, shamed, humiliated, and driven from society as we know it. The far left wants to coerce you into saying what you know to be false and scare you out of saying what you know to be true.
Exactly. Very nicely put. Of course, from his acceptance speech last summer in Milwaukee when he got the Republican nomination for president, cancel culture is a synonym for censorship, the effect to coerce people into repeating slogans they know are not true and not stating the obvious, the true things out loud. That is censorship. And Donald Trump took a public stand against it again and again and again and led by example on this question again and again and again. That is the fifth pillar of MAGA. So to restate, there are 5 components of the MAGA movement, ideological components, pillars, and they are America first, the belief, the guiding principle above all others that every decision the U.S. government makes ought to be to the benefit of the United States. 2, a country has to have borders. The people who live in a country decide who lives here. No one else decides. The people of the country should be in charge of who their neighbors are because they own the country. Number 3, no more pointless wars. We've done it. It hasn't worked. This country's not actually won a war decisively since 1945, and we did it with the help of Joseph Stalin. So let's get real. This hasn't worked, and we haven't done it for ourselves. We've done it for others through lobbying campaigns, pressure campaigns, and ideological nonsense that in retrospect looks completely absurd, and those of us who fell for it are deeply ashamed that we did because it was dumb then and even dumber now. 3, globalization has not worked for the United States. You can't have an economy based on real estate and finance. Sorry, maybe if you're Hong Kong or Singapore, but a continent-sized country needs to make things. Finance and real estate are not productive industries. One just keeps reselling a piece of ground, maybe you improve it a little bit, but ultimately, what have you created? And the other basically just loans money and interest. Now, they probably have a place in a broader economy, but if your whole economy is just finance and real estate, your country's going to die, and ours is, to the benefit of a small number of people, but not to the benefit of the 350 million who live here. And 5, pillar number 5, free speech is the basis of America. That's the fundamental human right that this country exists to protect. And so any attempt to abridge it must be fought tooth and nail, period. So you would think that every Republican would agree with all of these. In fact, you think every Democrat would. These are not controversial ideas. These are not let's round our enemies up or something, or like, these are not crazy. These are foundational American ideals. Trump has from day one been a moderate, actually. What's immoderate about those goals? Nothing, except that they challenge the way that things were done. And so if you look at it with clear eyes, backward for the last 10 years, Donald Trump's real battle has not been against Democrats. It's been against Republicans. Donald Trump was not a Republican before he ran for president. He was a Democrat or an independent or a frequent talk show guest or a beauty pageant host or whatever, but he was not a Republican. And so his real battle was then and is now against the Republican Party. And the existing players in that party hated all 5 pillars, all 5, because they were a direct challenge to their stewardship of the party and the country over decades. And by this point, the Republican Party had been so captured by special interests, by donors, that they were committed to the opposite on all 5. They were not acting. They didn't put the country's interests above all others in their decision making. That's ridiculous. They did absolutely nothing to secure the border. And they still aren't. Ted Cruz, who's a big MAGA guy. Ted Cruz, of course, ran against Trump in 2016, but Ted Cruz was a sitting senator from Texas for the entire Biden administration, where they sent over 12 million people into his state illegally over the border. Now, if Ted Cruz had held like a press conference every week and said to the governor of his state, Greg Abbott, I'm the senator from Texas, our state's being invaded, it's an entry point for the country, this is destroying Texas and America, mobilize the National Guard today and seal that border. And if that precipitates a conflict with the federal government, so be it. This is illegal, it's immoral, and it's going to wreck this country. National Guard exists for a reason, use it now. If he'd done that, that would have happened, but he didn't, because he was busy serving his masters in another country, which is not our country. And that is true not just of Ted Cruz, who's the most kind of pathetic, craven example, but of so many Republican politicians. They didn't want closed borders because their donors didn't want closed borders. Of course, they were all in on the war on terror, and they refused even to look backwards and assess whether or not what they had advocated for had succeeded. They were all in on the Iraq war, like I was. But the difference is they refused to admit that they were wrong. And millions of people died as a result of that, of their being wrong. And our treasury was emptied, and the US dollar devalued completely to the point where gold is over 4,000 today. Why is that? Maybe because we spent like $6 trillion on the war on terror, got nothing out of it. We sent pallets of cash to warlords in various countries. What did we get out of that? Nothing. We armed the Taliban. What did we get out of that? Nothing. The whole thing was insane. If you can't say that was bad, if you can't say I'm sorry for supporting that, you're a deeply corrupt person. And Trump called them out and they hated him for it. As to globalization, they benefited from it. Of course, they're tools of the finance class. Of course, every one of them. They had no real interest in ending that. And on free speech, perhaps most shamefully of all, the Republican Party's core institutions, its publications, National Review, the New York Post, Fox News, whatever, its think tanks, too many even to mention, all of them acted not as guardians of free speech, pushing the limits of acceptable discourse, encouraging people to open their minds and think creatively about what's best for the country. No, They acted as scolds, as crossing guards, forcing their fellow conservatives to shut up and get back in lane. That's the whole career of William F. Buckley, was telling fellow conservatives that's not acceptable. They weren't for free speech. They were just the opposite. They were censors. And Trump exposed all of that. And they hated him for it. All of them. There are very few Republican office holders in 2016 or 2020 or 2024, or even right now in October of 2025, who sincerely like Trump. They hate Trump because he represents everything they're opposed to. They hate Trump, including people who work for Trump, hate Trump. And some of them said it out loud. Here's one of Trump's new best friends back in 2016 explaining how much he hates Donald Trump.
At some point, you got to stand up to it. I do not like bullies, and I never have. So I will not be voting for Donald Trump, and he can thank Roger Stone. And if they piss me off one more time, I'm going to urge millions and millions of you, should he get the nomination, not to vote for him either. I'm very serious about this.
Mark Levin is very serious about this. So why was Mark Levin mad? Why was he so mad? Why was Bill Kristol so mad? They're both kind of for Trump, actually. I remember very well. I knew them. And a lot of other people in Washington, very much like them. Why were they so mad at Trump? Well, that was early April of 2016. That was a few weeks after Trump announced at that earlier referenced primary debate in South Carolina that the Iraq War was a mistake. Whoa, that was too far. Because any politician who will acknowledge that the Iraq War was a mistake probably won't get on board with the future Iraq War. And that's all they cared about, was more Iraq wars, waged on behalf of another country. Its interest, not ours. Irrelevant the damage to the United States, irrelevant the cost, irrelevant the death toll. They wanted politicians who would do that again. And anyone who called it a mistake probably wouldn't. And so it's just worth remembering that some of Donald Trump's staunchest allies, the ones always telling you, lecturing you about MAGA and telling you who's in, who's out, you're not MAGA, you're not MAGA. Those very same people disagree with every single one of Donald Trump's 5 stated rationales for running, and much more important than that, all 5 reasons that tens of millions of Americans voted for him. They don't just disagree with Trump, they disagree with the bulk of the country who want these things badly. And those people are now telling you, oh, you're not MAGA. This is the pigs and the men becoming indistinguishable in the final scene of Animal Farm. And again, it's organic. This happens to all institutions. It will happen unless someone stops it, unless there is a clear and persistent and repeated articulation of what we're doing here. What is this about? Is it about one guy? No, it's not. Sorry. It's not about one guy. A guy to whom most of us will always be grateful for articulating vitally important principles out loud, being the first one in my lifetime to do so. God bless you for doing that. But it's bigger than any person. It's about the survival of the country. And it's about these 5 facts, these principles, these pillars. That's what MAGA is. And so you can measure anybody who claims to lead the movement against those 5 things, because they don't change until they're fixed, which they have not been.